The United States' response to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is closer than ever. The American military is expected to respond very soon to the blocking of the Strait of Hormuz by the Revolutionary Guards of Iran. Iran has closed the Strait of Hormuz again, and Trump threatened to resume the fire. At least 2 ships came under live fire from Iran's Revolutionary Guards while crossing the Strait of Hormuz. And that the Iranians will not blackmail us. The United States is preparing to seize tankers carrying Iranian oil around the world as part of a new campaign that the administration is preparing, and is called economic fury. An American source said that this is also a warning to China. And today, we will bring you the internal information from inside Iran. Unfortunately, the situation in the country is worse than ever, because in Iran, citizens are realizing that the terrorist regime that makes their lives miserable has survived, and the citizens will pay the price. And on top of all of this is a quiet military coup taking place inside Iran. Today, we will bring you the drama behind the scenes in Tehran that is paralyzing Iran. And apparently, the Revolutionary Guards still have not pulled out their ace, which could paralyze global trade. And I'm talking about the Bab el-Mandab Strait. This is the strategic strait facing the danger of an Iranian blockade. Any disruption there not only threatens shipping in the Red Sea, but also expands its impact on global supply chains, energy prices, and trade between Asia and Europe. So, there will be no breakthrough. The war with Iran could resume in the coming days if the negotiations will not reach any kind of advance. And as I said, Iran has returned to threatening. Donald Trump refuses to be blackmailed, and one thing is clear: oil is not flowing from Hormuz. And we still have not even begun to talk about what's happening in Lebanon against the Hezbollah terrorist organization. I'm Yair Pinto, with me is Mati Shoshani, and we are boots on the ground. We bring you the full truth about what's happening in Israel, and also the full truth about what's happening in our neighborhood, the Middle East. And this is the opening of day 50 of the war, Roaring Lion, or by its American name, Epic Fury. The fate of the ceasefire in the Gulf appears uncertain amidst escalating rhetoric between Tehran and Washington, while the contacts between them, mediated by Pakistan, continue. But it turns out that in less than a day, the Strait of Hormuz, which the president promised Iran will not use as a weapon any longer, has been closed. Who decided this in Tehran? Why did the news agency identified with the Revolutionary Guards attack the foreign minister of Israel? And is there any chance for a diplomatic solution? This is when the Iranians are signaling that they will not agree to waste time on negotiations. So, despite Donald Trump's optimism, tensions with Iran are worsening. The Strait of Hormuz has been closed again. The negotiations are stuck, and the United States is reinforcing its forces ahead of a possibility of a near escalation. But do not get misunderstood. Don't misunderstand the situation, because the United States is really reinforcing its forces. And I'm talking about tens of thousands of fighters and also military technology that is greater than anything that has been here until now. Iran's blockade of the Strait of Hormuz is taking place once more. They are claiming it because of the American blockade on the Iranian oil tankers and fired at tankers in the sea. The headquarters that are managing the fighting in Iran announced that because of the continuation of the American blockade on the ports, which Donald Trump said that he refuses to remove, the Strait of Hormuz is returning to the tight control of the military. The meaning? Closure of the strait to free passage. And we have a report. 20 ships have already turned around, and the Revolutionary Guards fired at least at 2 of them. The United States is preparing to seize tankers that are carrying Iranian oil around the world as part of a new campaign that the administration calls economic fury. An American source said that this is also a warning to China. At an event in the White House, the president referred to the Revolutionary Guard's announcement about closing the strait one day after it was opened and said, "They're being a little bit smart." And at the same time, he claimed that the negotiations are progressing well, stating that we will have information by the end of the day. And meanwhile, Iran announced that the strait will remain blocked until sustainable peace in this region. And in Lebanon, the IDF announced that it struck in southern Lebanon because of a ceasefire violation. And the president of France announced that Hezbollah killed a French soldier. According to the army's statement, it attacked from the air and with artillery. The Hezbollah operatives who approached the forces in a way that posed an immediate threat. The IDF stressed that actions of self-defense and the removal of the threats are not limited by the ceasefire. So Hezbollah killed a French soldier in southern Lebanon, and this caused peak tension in southern Lebanon and carried an international blood price. French President Emmanuel Macron confirmed today that a French soldier was killed in a deadly attack that occurred in southern Lebanon by the Hezbollah terrorist organization. In a sharp statement released by the Élysée Palace, Macron pointed a direct accusing finger at the Hezbollah terrorist organization. According to the French president, all the evidence collected so far clearly points to Hezbollah as the party responsible for the attack. And in Hezbollah, they are threatening the president of Lebanon just before the negotiations meetings with Israel and claim that he will lose his status if he meets with Prime Minister Netanyahu. End quote. It's important to remember that Hezbollah in the past has already assassinated many political figures in Lebanon. Senior organizational officials Nawaf el-Moussawi advised Joseph Aoun not to surrender to Trump's dictates, while in the background, the option of a historic meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu in the United States of America is still on the table. The Lebanese president had earlier spoken against voices of betrayal and promised to save the country. I'm Yair Pinto. With me is Mati Shoshani, and we are boots on the ground. We bring you the full truth about what's happening in Israel. And this is day 50 of the war against the Revolutionary Guards in Iran, which is the head of the crumbling axis of evil in the Middle East. And 1 second before we begin, I want to call on you to keep spreading the truth. Share our content with as many people as possible. Click on the subscribe button. Most importantly, do not forget to look for me, Yair Pinto, and for Mati Shoshani on our social media platforms in order to get our behind-the-scene perspective of what it's like to live in Israel in this war. So, our senior Middle East correspondent, Mati Shoshani, is with us now. Mati, can you hear me? How are you doing?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Great, me too. I can hear you very well. And can you give us an explanation of what happened? The Iranians just reclosed the Strait of Hormuz, and they also opened fire against 2 oil tankers. Are we about to see missiles coming from Iran towards Israel and towards US bases in this region?
I don't think we're there yet. I think we're getting close to that. My sense is what we're watching or observing is 2 different things that are happening at the same time. One is conflict between the United States and Iran over the negotiation terms. Just to make a long story short, the Iranians are claiming that because the US has a blockade on them, that they are not opening up the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, this is a very comfortable lie for the Iranians, because opening up the Strait of Hormuz was the first and most important condition of the ceasefire agreement, which they refused to do, hence the blockade. So, of course, they love picking and choosing the facts and the reality that they live within, and we're not surprised by that. So that's one thing that's happening. The second part is there's several voices within the Iranian regime, and it's a little confusing. They said they would open up the Strait of Hormuz. President Trump tweeted repeatedly, the Strait of Hormuz is open. Ships tried to travel through the Strait of Hormuz. From what we know, several dozen of them were on their way. And then the Iranians opened fire. Now, I don't know if you got to hear this, Yael, but there's some recordings that were released a couple hours ago of some of the captains of the ships screaming over the radio at the Iranians and saying, Iran, what are you doing? You fired on us. And the Iranians respond with these, vague statements of you should have coordinated, you should have paid, et cetera, et cetera. What's really happening there is the Iranians are communicating on different channels. They're saying one thing and doing something entirely different. These ships were told by the Iranians, this is not a confusion. They were told they would be able to travel, and then the Iranians fired on them. And why? I think that indicates something about the internal politics that are taking place, but also on how complicated this is, how volatile the situation actually is in the Strait of Hormuz.
So, Mati, what's the response of the Americans? Because we hear that the United States have launched another campaign called Economic Fury. So it's kind of like an offshoot of the Epic Fury war that was a kinetic battle between rockets, missiles, commando forces against the IRGC. And now this is a broader economic pressure. Can you explain what's actually happening against the Iranians?
Yeah. So there's a couple things. One, let me explain the pressure point for our audience. The Iranians are losing somewhere between $350 and $450 million a day by having the Strait of Hormuz closed in direct losses. That's a revenue from selling oil. Run the numbers, we're talking estimations of 10 to 13 or $14 billion a month just from the oil revenue, not including other things that they exported. That's a substantial amount of money for any country. By the way, people might find it really interesting that the U.S. is not losing money from the blockade on the Strait of Hormuz. In fact, the U.S. economy is making money over this because the U.S. has a ton of oil, and it's now selling back to other countries enriched, or what we call, let's call it the results of the petroleum refinement process. The diesel fuel, the gasoline, etc., is being sold to Asian markets now by U.S. companies. So it's a really interesting battle when it comes to the economy. The U.S. put a blockade on Iran to put a financial squeeze on them, but there's one more substantial step that they can take, which they're threatening. And that threat is to take the oil off, or take the ships that are moving oil on behalf of Iran. Let me just explain that for a second. Today, we're recording this. It is the end of Saturday. Sorry, we're not recording. We're live. Today, we're... what am I talking about? Right now, as we stand here, it's the end of the weekend in Israel. The blockade hasn't been that long. And before that, a bunch of ships left from Iran to the tune of about 1.5 million barrels per day, left on their way to markets. Those ships, many of them, have still not arrived at their destination. Why? We've talked about this repeatedly. Oil tankers move very slowly. How slowly? Imagine a very relaxed ride on a bicycle or a light jog of a fit person. That's how slow these ships are moving. So the U.S. still has the power to apprehend, to take over, to even, let's call it, nationalize or privatize some of these tankers and say, thank you, you're going to pay for the damages that Iran created. So they're threatening essentially a financial doomsday on the Iranian regime. And the Iranians, of course, like to play it cool. We're not afraid. We're not hurting. Don't worry, we can stand long, very strong stamina, et cetera, et cetera. Look, reality is complicated, Yael. If your country and your main source of income is cut off completely and you're bleeding cash, I mean, literally bleeding, literally and figuratively speaking, it's not very long before you really start thinking about your life choices. And I'd say differently, where other people in your government start thinking about whether they should listen to you or not in the future. So it's a really complicated situation for the Iranians and the U.S. And I need to say this in a very clear way. The U.S. is not suffering here. The U.S. economy is not losing money. The U.S. Government is not losing money. And when it comes to stock and, and all those things, one, these are long-term trends. People invest on long-term. People think about the long-term. And the U.S. has been playing a very careful and clever game here when it comes to the economic damage. So the main point is maximum financial pressure on the Iranian regime to essentially bankrupt the Ayatollah regime or cut off their funding altogether, so they cannot continue to wage a war. The goal here, of course, going back to your first question, the goal is to end the war. It's not to go back to war. President Trump wants to negotiate, has been very clear about this. But the Iranians aren't leaving much of a choice aside from stacking more and more pressure on them to force a decision where they come to the negotiation table willing to actually make the concessions that are needed to move forward in the agreement.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Mati. And I want to shift our attention now to what's happening in Lebanon. I mean, I'm standing here now at the David's Harp Hotel on the Sea of Galilee, not far from the border between Israel and Syria, Israel and Lebanon. And we just heard reports that Hezbollah took out a French soldier that is part of the peacekeeping forces in South Lebanon. Is that going to change the situation and the declared ceasefire that Trump just declared between Israel and Lebanon? By the way, he declared that between Israel and Lebanon or between Israel and Hezbollah? And who's like obligated to actually hold its file?
Yeah, those are all really good questions, Abe. One, the very unfortunate demise of the French soldier is not going to change the situation. It's going to upset the French, but they have not been significant in this game whatsoever. It's not going to change the situation. Yes, the negotiation is taking place between, well, not negotiation, the ceasefire is taking place between Israel and the Lebanese government led by Joseph Aoun. That's where the ceasefire takes place. Hezbollah are not supposed to be part of the ceasefire. They're supposed to be the responsibility, let's call it the homework, of the Lebanese government. But that's where really things get complicated, Yael, in the sense that the Lebanese government and Lebanese armed forces aren't necessarily able to actually stop the Hezbollah fighters. We've seen that just in this incident. They're intentionally, they're going to tell you it was a mistake, Yael. They're going to say it was a mistake, very unfortunate. We didn't mean to, to harm the French peacekeepers. Nonsense. They absolutely meant to do this, and this is exactly the kind of thing they do. They, for years, have been threatening the peacekeepers within Lebanon. And this is a story that should be told in another time. But the fact that the peacekeepers were ineffective, the fact that the UN cooperated with Hezbollah, wasn't necessarily because they ideologically aligned with them. It was because they were threatened by Hezbollah. Now, an army shouldn't be threatened by a terrorist organization, but that's not the point here. They do threaten, they do harm these people. I want to say there were also IDF soldiers. One was killed and several were injured today in Lebanon from an IED that was supposedly placed before the ceasefire took effect. But look, the war is not over there. And what's happening over there is still this very tense situation where there's a lot of pressure on the Lebanese government to enter into a substantial ceasefire. Let me explain why it's the Lebanese government, not Israel. Israel wants to end the war in Lebanon. Israel doesn't want to be fighting Hezbollah. Our whole goal in the last year and a half was to have the Lebanese armed forces, and this is, by the way, together with the US government. Our goal was to have the Lebanese armed forces, let's call it, disarm the Hezbollah organization, remove them from the country, cut off their funding, and cut off their equipment transfers. But they haven't been able to do that. That's why we're fighting in Lebanon. We're fighting because the Lebanese government, the Lebanese armed forces, have not been able to stop Hezbollah. Now, here's the problematic part here. Joseph Aoun, the head of the state of Lebanon, the elected head, I should say, which is important and an anomaly in the Middle East, he says this. No, he says the following, and this is people close to him keep saying, it is very dangerous for him to negotiate directly right now with Prime Minister Netanyahu. They're saying this publicly. There's a lot of internal pressure, excuse me, a lot of internal pressure within Lebanon, a lot of threats coming his way from Hezbollah and from others, and they're not sure it is safe enough to negotiate directly with Israel. And if ever there was a question of whether or not there's foreign influence on what's happening in Lebanon, here's your answer. The Iranian terrorists within Lebanon are so dangerous that they're threatening their own government with death if they negotiate for peace. That's the relationship that's taking place there. They're being threatened by Hezbollah and factions connected to Hezbollah with a threat of death if they negotiate for peace. And that just shows you how disconnected Hezbollah is from the well-being of Lebanon, how detrimental, how destructive the Iranian influence is on the Middle East. This is the kind of things they do. They scare countries into creating more death and more destruction, even to the point of threatening them not to make a peace agreement or any kind of long-standing ceasefire. So it's a complicated situation. Yeah, I want to go back for a second to Iran because we forgot to mention something. There's one important point there that needs to be mentioned, which is the fact that their government isn't able to speak on a single voice. And I want to point this out for a second. They've been saying conflicting messages. They on the one hand said, this is yesterday, you're hearing messages coming from, they have these different entities that have been created in the war, where there's like the Islamic War Management Committee, all these bizarre names, the Shia, whatever, the names don't really matter right now, but essentially there are these different factions within the IRGC and the Ayatollah regime that are speaking against members of the government. So for instance, the foreign minister says the Strait of Hormuz is opened, and they will, publicly, by the way, say this was a flawed and terrible tweet. This is not actually what we agreed to. We agreed to open the straits when the blockade ends, which was not the agreement, by the way. And then they start, that really explains the events that took place here today. If we had a question of how broken down the communication is within the Iranian regime, we've received that answer. If we had a question of how, let's call it non-wholesome, their communication is, how ununited they are in their leadership, we have that answer. There is no one decisive leader in Iran right now, and there's a very unclear situation and answer to who can actually commit to something on behalf of this government. Now, why am I saying this? Because this is important for the next steps. The ceasefire is supposed to end on Tuesday, I believe, a couple days from now. And when that ends, someone on the Iranian side, or if it ends, someone on the Iranian side needs to say, I will sign a document that says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then someone on the American side needs to have the security or the faith in them to actually be able to carry out those decisions. And right now, I'm not entirely sure that's actually possible. It's a very, very complicated situation that we need to be, tracking with.
Yeah, exactly. Plus, also, we're receiving messages from the social media accounts of Mujtaba Khamenei against the opening of the Strait of Hormuz and for the continuation of the conflict with the Americans. So we're not sure even if he's the leader in charge or he's just another AI figure, like the Mossad is now accusing the spokesperson of the Iranian regime of being basically a AI personality that does not exist in the real world and cannot be eliminated.
Well, I don't know, what I can tell you is that it seems that the supreme leader of Iran has a crippling addiction to using only social media and text and not appearing in public. The pun was intended, because we've never heard from him. We don't know what his situation is. We don't know, we don't know if he's alive or not. We don't know if he is alive, if he's actually present and clear-minded. We're really not sure what it is. And the fact that they haven't been able to show him or show any proof of his situation really confirms the fact that there's a huge lack of information about what is actually happening. And then the way they've been communicating in recent days gives us a clear understanding that they're not speaking in one voice. And I would dare say that there's the beginning of rifts within the leadership of Iran over what the right thing to do is and whether or not a ceasefire should happen or not, and of course, what the terms for that would be.
Well, definitely, Mati. So thank you so much for this update, and we'll see you again tomorrow on another Boots on the Ground live edition. Thank you, Mati.
Thank you.
And to all of us that are just joining this TBN Israel Boots on the Ground live update, this is Saturday evening here in the northern parts of Israel, coming to you from the Sea of Galilee, from the David's Harp Hotel. Please subscribe if this is your first time so that you never miss another update. And also, if you want to look at the behind the scenes of this war, look for Yair Pinto and Mati Shoshani on our social media platforms, because many Israelis are still juggling reserve duty in the IDF while trying to get back to work and also to handle their day-to-day lives. And it's not easy because your body is tired, your mind is overloaded, and the pressure doesn't stop when the uniform comes off. Sometimes it even increases. And I've been there, coming home from reserve duty, trying to be present for my family, catching up at work while still feeling like I'm in a survival mode. It takes strength, it takes energy, and it takes faith to push through. And that's why I started using Vinia. It's an Israeli supplement made from red grape cells that helps improve the blood flow to your heart, your brain, and your muscles. For me, that meant better focus, more energy, and fewer days of that foggy burnt out feeling. So I started using it during my reserve duty, specifically in the Gaza Strip, and I'm still using it today. There's also a coffee version and there's also a tea version. And either way works, but try it for yourself. I really recommend. If you want to try it, go to vinyatbnisrael.com. Again, that's vinyatbnisrael.com or call 800-638-1944. 800-638-1944. So Faith helped me stay grounded and Vinya helped me stay sharp. Let's get back to the news because the night opened with live fire in the heart of one of the most sensitive shipping lanes in the world. At least 2 merchant vessels trying to cross the Strait of Hormuz reported coming under fire from Revolutionary Guards boats after Tehran announced that it was once again tightening its control over that strait. And within a short time, ships that had already moved towards the route began turning back. And radio calls across the maritime network made one thing very clear to the captains. From Iran's point of view, the passage was no longer open. And the question now is a very sharp one. Is this just another Iranian pressure tactic on the way to negotiations, or have we already entered a new phase in which the sea itself is once again becoming an active battlefield? Let me know what you think about this in the comments. Because this day, day 50 of the Roaring Lion War, or by its American name, Epic Fury, and this day is ending with a much less stable picture than what we've been used to specifically yesterday, because less than 24 hours ago, Donald Trump was projecting optimism. He wrote that it was a great day for the world. He claimed that Iran had agreed never to close the Strait of Hormuz again. He even spoke about the strait being fully open for business, about Iran clearing naval mines with the help of the United States, and about the entire agreement moving forward very quickly. But in the Middle East, as you already know, sometimes only a few hours stand between one social media post and reality. And that is enough to turn a picture of calm into a picture of escalation. This morning, the picture changed completely. It was not the Iranian foreign minister who led that shift, but the Qatam El Anbiya headquarters, the body directing the fighting, together with the Revolutionary Guards. The announcement was clear. Control over the Strait of Hormuz was returning to its previous state. In other words, strict military oversight, which in practice means renewed restrictions on free passage. Iran's explanation was that even if limited movement had been allowed earlier, the United States had not lifted its blockade on the Iranian ports. And so, from Tehran's perspective, Washington had violated the spirit of the understandings. Iranian officials even returned to using the language of American piracy, nothing less. And it did not remain at the level of declarations. According to the reports, around 20 ships that were already preparing to cross the strait turned back. One tanker owner said that he received radio messages from the Revolutionary Guards saying that the strait was closed. And earlier in the day, a convoy of 8 tankers had still been seen making its way through the sea in what looked like an initial attempt to test whether normal traffic could resume. But that normalcy lasted only a very short time. Once the shooting began, the picture returned to what it had been throughout the recent weeks: a crowded maritime corridor, under threat, managed through fear. Here, it's important to pause on the operational point because our viewers, like you, understand how an event like this actually happens. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another waterway. It is a massive geographical choke point. Even before the war, about 1/5 of the world's oil trade passed through it. Every ship entering that area knows it is moving through a narrow, highly sensitive, heavily monitored, and very vulnerable corridor. That's why 2 fast boats, 1 radio message, and controlled fire towards a civilian vessel are enough to turn an entire commercial route into a strategic bottleneck. You do not need a full fleet for that. You need control, boldness, and the knowledge that the global market will react before you have even started a full scale naval war. And that's exactly what Iran tried to do today. On the one hand, it did not formally declare a full war with the United States. On the other hand, it brought back the global sense of danger. It reminded the world that as long as the war has not truly ended, and as long as what it calls a sustainable peace has not been achieved, it still has its finger on one of the most important valves in the world. That's also why Tehran kept using ambiguous language. Not we closed it forever. Not no one can pass at all, but tight control, oversight, freedom of movement has not been restored. The situation remains unchanged. This is not just diplomatic language, it is a method to preserve fog in order to preserve fear. But Washington is no longer content with words alone. Trump said plainly today they will not blackmail us. On one hand, he tried to maintain a tone of optimism and claimed that the talks are still going very well, that there would be more information by the end of the day, and that Iran is being a little tricky, as it has been for decades. And on the other hand, he repeated the threat that if there is no agreement by Wednesday, he may not extend the ceasefire, and the blockade on Iranian ports will remain at full strength. In simple terms, the White House is still talking about a deal, but the American military is talking in the language of preparation. And that preparation is already visible on the ground. The United States is not only enforcing a naval blockade, it is also preparing to expand it. The dramatic report tonight is that the United States military is expected in the coming days to move against the Iranian oil tankers and the commercial vessels that are linked to Iran, even in international waters, and not only near Hormuz. And this is a new phase of pressure on Tehran. The administration is already giving it a name: economic fury. In other words, not only to break Iran's leverage at sea, but also to go after its money, its shadow oil trade, its shadow fleet, the cargo moving to China, the network that keeps the regime alive. And this explains the logic. The United States has already understood that the war against Iran is not only about missiles, not only about uranium, and not only about the ceasefire. It is also about supply lanes, transit fees, oil, maritime insurance, and the ability of an isolated regime to keep selling energy through a gray market. So, if the blockade was once regional, there is now an effort to make it almost global. One American official has already said that this move is also a warning to China, because if 90% of the Iranian oil exports ultimately end up in Beijing, then the pressure on Tehran also runs through the country buying from it. And that also explains why today we saw not only an American threat, but also a growing American buildup. And according to the reports, the United States is continuing to pour very heavy forces into the region. The aircraft carrier Gerald Ford has returned to the theater together with destroyers. The Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier is already operating in the Arabian Sea. The George H.W. Bush is on its way into the arena. And when you add that to the tens of thousands of troops, the aircraft, the enforcement systems, and the fact that in recent days reports have already spoken of more than 10,000 troops, 12 warships, and over 100 aircrafts involved in tightening the siege, one picture emerges very clear. Even if Trump wants a deal, he wants to reach it with a gun on the table. And behind all of this stands another front, quieter but still deeply important, the front of contradictory messages. Because if you look at the last 24 hours in Tehran, you see almost two different voices. Yesterday, Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi announced the opening of the strait for the duration of the Lebanese ceasefire. Trump rushed to thank him. Oil prices immediately dropped. The global market understood that perhaps there was finally some relief, but then, in less than a day, Katam El Anbiya, came in and shut the passage down again. Even the news agency identified with the Revolutionary Guards attacked the foreign minister's messages, as if it has been partial, flawed, or at the very least, not reflective of all actual conditions. And this is a point that must be put under a spotlight. Who is really making the decisions in Iran? The political leadership, the foreign minister, the president, or is the real finger on the button that is held by the military security system of the Revolutionary Guards? In the Arab world, people are already talking in the last day about a real split at the top, about the political circle moving in one direction, while the military security circle moves in another. There is even talk about a quiet military coup. We need to be careful with that term because it is not a proven fact, but one fact is already clear. The messages coming out of Tehran are contradictory, and that contradiction points to a struggle of power. That struggle is also connected to the big question of the day. What, if anything, has actually been agreed in the negotiations with the United States? Good question, right? Trump claimed that Iran had agreed to almost everything. There were reports that he said that Tehran was ready to stop encircling and enriching uranium. There are also claims that he presented as if Iran would hand over its enriched materials, but the Iranian side has already issued a denial. A senior Iranian source said that no agreement had been reached to hand over the uranium and that the American demands are still unreasonable. That applies to enrichment, to the full removal of restrictions, and to the broader terms of the agreement as well. And this takes us back to one very important line that came today from Israel's security establishment. A senior official said that the objectives in Iran had been achieved and that the regime is coming to the negotiating table naked. He said the regime is very weak, the economy is very weak, and that what the IDF was tasked to do at the beginning of the operation was carried out. But he added something even more important. Together with the Americans, there is readiness to return to the fighting at short notice, and there is still the ability to strike anything that they want. In other words, from Israel's perspective, this is not the end of the story. This is a phase in which they're checking whether military pressure can be turned into a diplomatic gain, and if not, the military option is still on the table. In the meantime, we need your help in spreading the truth. We need you to follow us, to subscribe to TBN Israel on YouTube if you like these reports. We're here multiple times a day. Every day we go live and we bring you another report in the evening. So let a friend know if he wants to be updated about what's happening in Israel and in the Middle East. And make sure to subscribe to TBN Israel so you never miss another update of Boots on the Ground. And if you want to see this war through our eyes behind the scenes, look for Yair Pinto and for Mati Shoshani on our social media platforms. Just make sure you follow the official accounts. So to understand how weak Iran is really, you also have to look inwards, not only at the strait, not only at diplomacy, but at the lives of ordinary people inside the country. And today, difficult reports came from there as well. Prices are soaring. Lines are growing. Gaps are widening. Pressure is intensifying. One example alone is enough to show the depth of this crisis. 1 kilogram of chicken that cost 86,500 tuman, that's Iranian currency, last year, is now being sold for 318,000 of the Iranian currency. A tray of eggs has reached 500,000. A kilogram of sheep cheese costs 1,000,000 toman. Corn is at 120,000. A kilogram of hummus is at 250,000. This is not just an economy under strain. This is a public sense of suffocation. And Iranian civilians understand something else as well. Not only did the war fail to bring down the regime, but now that regime has survived. They may be the ones who pay the highest price. There is a double fear inside Iran. On the one side, deeper economic collapse. On the other side, a harsher hand from the security apparatus. Citizens are already saying that the real problems will begin now, that once the internal front quiets down, the regime will turn its attention back to the internal front. So when we talk about achievements and Iranian weakness, we also have to tell the full truth. The regime may be wounded, but the Iranian public is still the first one likely to absorb the cost. And amidst all of this, Iran has probably still not played its final ace. Because if Hormuz is a powerful card, Bab el Mandab is the card that can widen the game from Gulf oil to the supply chains between Asia and Europe. This is the Gate of Tears, a passage connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Eden and the Indian Ocean. Between 10 and 15% of global trade passes through it. About 5 to 6 million barrels of oil move through it every single day. If it becomes an active threat zone, ships will be forced to sail around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 10 to 15 days to the journey and sharply increasing the costs. This is also where the Houthis in Yemen once again become relevant, even if not yet at full force because of Iran. Bab el Mandab is not just a waterway, it is a regional lever through its allies. A threat there would not only hit Europe, it will also strike trade with Asia, energy routes, the Red Sea, and to some extent, Israel as well. So, even if the spotlight is currently on Hormuz, no one should be confused. The maritime map of this war is much wider. And now, let's move to Lebanon, not far from where I'm standing, because there too this day was far from truly quiet. The IDF announced that it struck several areas in southern Lebanon after terrorists were identified moving towards forces south of the Yellow Line in a way that created an immediate threat. The Air Force and the ground forces carried out strikes, artillery fire, and was also used in this support to attack the terrorists, and also terror infrastructures were destroyed. The message from the IDF was very direct. Actions for self-defense and threat removal are not limited by these ceasefire. In other words, from Israel's perspective, a ceasefire is not permission for Hezbollah to quietly move back into threatening positions. And in that same atmosphere came the unusual international incident of this day. A French soldier serving with UNIFIL was killed in southern Lebanon, and 3 others were wounded, 2 of them seriously. The force had been operating to clear unexploded ordnance and reopen a road to isolate positions near Rendouria when a small arms fire was opened against it. President Macron of France said the evidence points to Hezbollah as responsible. UNIFIL described it as a deliberate attack that could amount to a violation of the international law and even a war crime. Hezbollah denied responsibility, but the key fact is this: less than 48 hours after the ceasefire, and there is already a fatality amongst the international peacekeeping forces in Lebanon. And it did not stop there. Hezbollah is also openly escalating politically against Lebanese President Joseph Aoun. Senior Hezbollah figure Nawaf el-Mawasi warned that if Aoun meets with Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, he will lose his status as president of the state. This is not a marginal statement. In Lebanon, when Hezbollah speaks this way, everyone understands the meaning. This is not just a political disagreement. It is a reminder of the militia's real power inside the country. President Aoun tried to project firmness, speaking against voices of betrayal and promising to save the country, but the threat had already been placed on the table. And inside Hezbollah itself, the tone today is much more aggressive. Senior figures are saying there will be no return to the previous situation, no more strategic patience, no acceptance of humiliating negotiations, and that if Lebanon's state institutions go one way, they will go another. And one Hezbollah member of parliament even said that they had contacted the leadership in Iran and informed it of what they call Israeli violations of the ceasefire. In other words, the connection between Beirut, Adachia, Tehran, and Hormuz has not been broken. It has simply taken on a different form. It's also important to remember what happened just before the ceasefire. Minutes before it came into effect, Israel carried out one of the more offensive moves in southern Lebanon, including a special forces operation in the Christofani Ridge at the foot of the Syrian Hermon. This was an operation designed to secure a better opening position for Israel inside the new reality, not only to shape perception, but also to improve its hold on the ground. Together with airstrikes, artillery fire, and attacks on terrorist infrastructure, the result was a picture in which Israel entered the ceasefire from a position of control, not from a position of withdrawal. And that's one of the reasons that Hezbollah is so pressured right now. The organization understands that the confrontation with Israel is not truly ending, and that this temporary calm could become a path through which official Lebanese people, the Americans, and perhaps also European actors try to push forward moves that weaken its power. That's where the threats come from. The talk about carrier pigeons, the claims that every commander that was killed has to be replaced and has already two replacements, and the continued attachment to Iran. When the organization loses freedom of action on the ground, it seeks strength through intimidation, messaging, and a new deterrence equation. So, if you connect all the arenas together, one very clear picture emerges. Hormuz is not truly open. The negotiations are not truly settled. The American blockade has not been lifted. Iran has not truly folded. The United States has not truly taken its finger off the trigger. Lebanon is not truly quiet. And Hezbollah has not truly calmed down. Day 50 of the war did not close the circle. It only revealed how each side is trying to buy time, improve its position, and reach the next stage from a stronger, more secure place. And this day also teaches something deeper about the war as a whole. It is no longer only a war of strikes and aircrafts. It is a war of maritime passages, energy markets, contradictory messages, shadow fleets, radio traffic at sea, economic pressure, presidents riding Gray Day while moving aircraft carrier at the same time, and revolutionary guards capable of returning the entire world to a state of alert with two boats and a short burst of gunfire. This is a war in which the big story sometimes hides about the whole inside the small details. A tanker turning back, a bridge repaired overnight, or one sentence from a senior defensive official saying, "We are not finished. We simply passed to see whether the pressure is working or not." Day 50 closed with Iran once again playing with the world's energy valve, the United States preparing to widen the pressure, and Lebanon already discovering that a ceasefire on paper does not stop the blood, the threats, or the struggle of power. So, are we really getting closer to a breakthrough, or only to the moment when all the fronts ignite together again? So please, help us share the truth of what's happening in this region. It's very important, and we call on you to do that by hitting the subscribe button on TBN Israel, and also leaving a comment, leaving a like, and never missing another update of Boots on the Ground. Because our vision is to share the truth so that you will know how to pray for the situation. So when you pray, pray tonight for the people of Israel, for the soldiers of the IDF that are fighting not far from me in Lebanon, and for the security forces of the United States, the Navy, the US Air Force, all the branches of the United States military and defensive forces that are in this region. And let's pray for the leadership to make the wise decisions. Let's keep praying for the peace of Jerusalem. Thank you for joining me. I'm Yair Pinto, reporting to you from the Sea of Galilee.